and we have an audience which is streaming as well as you hardy warriors who've actually shown up in person. So we're in one of these split screen moments for the world economy, where if you look at the data on the surface, you look at the latest World Bank update, for example, global growth for the next couple of years is projected to be exactly what it was last year, 2.6%. But under the hood, there's plenty of turbulence, a lot of uncertainty around the baseline forecast. We all know by now that two big things happened on January the 20th. President Trump's inauguration, but also the release of the DeepSeek R1 model. We also know that the market freakout on Monday was maybe the biggest freakout, or one of them, since the post-COVID freakouts. And of course, this was also caused by a leak from the Chinese lab. But joking aside, the point about January the 20th is that you've got these, it's just an indicator of the two of the big reasons why underneath the 2.7% steady forecast, you've got this huge uncertainty. The geopolitics stemming from Trump's arrival in office, and the uncertainty around how technology and specifically AI plays out. So with me to discuss all this and more, we have three of our favorite people. Right next to me, Doug Rediker, who is at Brookings and also the managing partner of International Capital Strategies. Then Adam Posen, who is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And then Karniol-Tambour, co-chief investment officer at Bridgewater. So we're going to start with the geopolitical shock, specifically with trade. And I thought I'd get Doug first to explain, we have a situation where, every day we get some statement from the administration, most recently the new Treasury Secretary saying one thing about a tariff outlook, which is sort of different to what the President then says later in the same day. So what do you think is actually going to happen with tariffs, and how do you even think about that?
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks, Mike, and all of you for being here. So you've asked a question that obviously there's no definitive answer, but let me frame it by taking your question and breaking it down. You said, every day we hear something else from the Trump administration, ... So let's ignore everything you hear from the Trump administration and focus on what Trump says. Because I think it is hard to say that Scott Bessent or Kevin Hassett or even the press secretary speaks for the president on this issue or anything else, but specifically on this issue. So we've had, since Trump's election campaign, but then after he was elected and then during the transition, we've had a series of market perceptions that it's all going to be okay because the famous take Trump seriously, not literally mantra comes in. He's checked by a fear of a negative market reaction. Stock market is what he cares about. Therefore, he won't do anything stupid and counterproductive. He's pro-business. The question is about sequencing and whether he does tax cuts and deregulation before he layers on tariffs. All that stuff gives a certain segment of the population, the financial markets and others, a comfort that Trump's not really serious about tariffs. And then you hear the Washington Post leaks and the Bloomberg leaks that Bessent is telling him to go slow, and everybody gets very comfortable. So when I talk to my clients and institutional investors, there's one camp that believes that wholeheartedly. There's another camp that listens to what Trump himself says. Remember, Trump never said, I'm going to do tariffs on day one. Trump said, I'm going to do tariffs. He said, I'm going to do some other things on day one, but he didn't say tariffs on day one. So the comfort that he didn't do tariffs on day one is not a promises made, promises not kept. It's just people read into it was going to be day one, and when it wasn't, they exhaled. But there are a lot of people who then believe he's going to do it. Now, why do they think that? Because he keeps telling us that he's going to do it. As recently as this past weekend, when he said February 1, there's the old saying, you can use a number and a date, but don't use a number or a date, but don't use a number and a date. Well, Trump used a number and a date, 25% February 1. Whether he adheres to that or not, we don't know. But there's another big chunk that believes he's going to go big on China and Mexico in particular, Canada and Mexico, and maybe China. Obviously, the Colombia thing is a separate issue entirely, but the tariffs are his favorite word. He's going to do it. It's going to be 25%. We don't know if it's going to be for negotiating purposes. or as an end unto itself, but that he's going to do it. And my big concern is I think that both sides, he'll never do tariffs and he'll definitely do tariffs, both believe with certainty that they are right, and both believe that the markets have priced in their view, which means there's going to be someone, a lot of someones, who are very surprised when he goes either one way or another. My view is he's going to use IEEPA, which is the only tariff tool, and I say tariff tool, there's tariffs are not actually built into IEEPA, but the expectation is it can be interpreted to allow him to impose tariffs. But it gives him unilateral discretion with almost no judicial, or there's a congressional check, but it won't be used. So he can do that on a dime, any way he wants to do it, effectively, simply by declaring an emergency, which he is prone to do for anything or everything. So I think he's going to do it. I think he's going to do it relatively aggressively. I think he's probably going to build in some optionality. So he might say, I'm doing this, but it won't be implemented for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, something like that, which gives him a chance to walk back if he needs to. But I do think he's going to go forward. I do think there are going to be some big surprises on the people who think he'll never do it. And I think we're going to have to see how that plays out in terms of negotiating with the individual countries, because I don't think they're all going to just suddenly capitulate.
I want to add one dimension to Doug's excellent portrayal and rightful discounting of some of the chatter. Our view at Peterson has been throughout that he was going to go heavy tongs after Mexico and China, and then the rest would be negotiated. The Canada is a bit of a surprise to us. We still think once the election happens and he gets a more favorable government in Canada, he will drop a lot of that. But the main point that I want to add to what Doug said is the fiscal aspect of this. You'll hear a lot of discussion, including from the Senate, but even from the President, about the idea that tariffs can be a significant source of revenue. And this is true under one side of affairs, which is they do what are called across-the-board tariffs. They put up 10, 15, 20% across a very wide range of countries and industries. And if they do that, then they're talking about 1.5% of GDP a year in revenues, which is real money. It's not enough to cover the tax cuts they're planning, but it's real money. The key point is that because of what's called, as many of you know, the reconciliation process, which is the only way you can pass a budget with 51 votes instead of 60 votes in the Senate, is that you have to, if they want to count that as revenue, they have to have it legislated, so the CBO can count it. But if they have it legislated, this goes to Doug's key point, then the ability of President Trump to use discretion on a bilateral basis and say, I'm doing this to you, you're nasty, I'm not doing this to you, you're not nasty, I'm doing this on steel, I'm not doing this on plastic, is constrained. And so I agree with Doug, there are these two camps, but I think there's a third camp, a third risk, which is, I think it's low probability, but I think it's rising, meaning it's like 25% probability, that they put on 15, 20% across the board tariffs for the sake of revenue. The Senate has to say this is a step to creating a consumption-based tax system instead of a corporate income-based tax system. And then Trump tries to use discretion on top of that. Now that's a nightmare scenario. But I think you have to actually price that in as a risk scenario.
Can I just, without getting too wonky on this, but I just want to make sure. So Alan's point on legislating tariffs is really important, but one of the second order issues on that is what's called PNTR. Right. Again, I'm not going to make this into a trade law seminar, but PNTR is basically most favored nation trade status, which every member of the WTO grants to every other member, and the U.S. granted that to China by law in 2000 or 2001 when we accepted China into the WTO. There's a move on the Hill to now take that away. When you hear Trump talk about 60% tariffs on China, that derives from the average tariff on China, if you took it away, would be 59.5. So let's assume that's where Trump gets his 60%. The problem with that is if Trump is the big deal maker, the one thing you can't do when you're cutting a deal is say, I will negotiate those tariffs up or down, even though I have to go back to Congress and get a vote for them to redo what they just undid. The Chinese are never going to negotiate that. So I think when you hear talk about these massive 60% tariffs, rolling back PNTR on China, it's a very big talk. In terms of the legislative benefit, it's about $400 or $500 billion for the budget, as Adam referenced. But the costs of that, in terms of negotiating leverage with China, are just astronomical.
I want to go to Karen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what we're hearing is that, one of Trump's central policies, the thing on which arguably he's the clearest, in terms of his history on a policy issue, is actually super unclear in the implementation details, how you would do it, do you go to Congress. But notwithstanding this confusion in his central policy, Karen, you were just at Davos. The atmosphere there, I'm told, was super bullish on the US. How do we reconcile these two things?
Well, look, I think that first, if you just step back and look at the US, right? If you take Trump out of the equation, pretend Trump didn't exist, you'd be looking at the United States and saying, pretty much growth is pretty good. Inflation has come down a good amount. It's not at a level where it's worrying policymakers nearly as much as they used to. And you have a Federal Reserve that really, really wants to believe that it can continue to at least ease a little bit. And it would take a lot to convince it to tighten. So if that's all you knew, you would say, this is a great time. Like, how much better could you ask in terms of a macro backdrop for investors? And the only thing that would kind of temper some of your enthusiasm would be that valuations are already pretty high. Markets already think this. And on Doug's comments of what's priced into the markets, I feel pretty sure that very high tariffs are not priced into the markets. If you really compare at company level, companies that would really be affected by high tariffs versus ones that won't, you don't see a big mispricing the way you did, for example, in Trump 1, where companies that would really benefit from a tax cut versus those that weren't, very quickly that pricing started getting into the markets and saying, this thing is about to happen and it's going to differentiate companies. Okay, so that was ignoring Trump. This should be a pretty good environment. Then you bring in Trump, and I think it's mixed. I think when you look at what he does to outlook the economy, it's mixed. You look at the fiscal side, and you basically say, here's somebody who wants to not just extend tax cuts, but increase them. And for companies in the stock market, obviously there's a disproportionate positive effect from lowering the corporate tax rate, right? You look at what he's saying on deregulation, and there's certain areas where it's just talk, and certain areas where at least the market has to say this could be meaningful. I would say that my personal impressions is that the breadth of CEOs across industries, that something regulatory under Biden was a big issue for them, and they are relieved that that is off the table, is much broader than I sort of appreciated, because people I think under Biden didn't want to be talking about the issues that they were having. But I've been surprised by what a breadth of industries have sort of said, no, something regulatory was in my way. So Trump doesn't have to necessarily deliver huge deregulation that's positive as much as take off a bunch of the stress and uncertainty the different sectors were feeling on regulation. And his team definitely believes they could also do positive on deregulation, certainly in energy, but also potentially, well outside of that. Immigration is obviously a negative and inflationary. People don't really know how to size how big of a deal that will really be. And then you bring in all the tariff issues. And one important thing to know about tariff issues is that the Federal Reserve, I think, would really rather see, whether they should or they shouldn't, I think they'd really rather see any inflation shock from the tariffs as a one-off shock that should not make them tighten monetary policy. So that sort of puts you in a place where you say, well, if the worst effect of tariffs is inflation, and that doesn't cause a tightening in monetary policy, you're not going to end up with a very damaged economy as a result of that. And then you go to all of these conversations you guys were having, the uncertainty about what they'll actually do and when. And I would say, look, I think the prolonged uncertainty about what will happen on tariffs basically benefits the United States, because businesses just say, in this environment of uncertainty, on the margin, I should probably just manufacture in the US. I don't know exactly, I don't know how bad this will be, but I don't want to certainly set up new things that are going to harm me. And you look at companies, you have identical almost European automakers, people like BMW and Stellantis, that made choices years ago, that today they're probably sitting there being like, wow, I had no idea the consequence of those choices. Whether they chose to say, every single SUV in the world is made in America, and we'll send the other SUVs to other countries, or no, in America I set up to make every car for Americans, and then that means I have to double do every type of car manufacturing around the world. I'm sure they had their own choices. They each made different choices in terms of efficiency, but I don't think they ever imagined when those choices were made what it would mean under a tariff policy like this. And so on the margin, I think the uncertainty makes you say maybe invest in the US. And then I will say, we take the rest of this conversation, probably the most important thing I would keep in mind is that it's a lot easier to get around bilateral tariffs.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier. So it can harm the one country you're doing the bilateral deal with, but it's a lot easier to get around. When you do across the board tariffs, you just don't have the same degree of getting around it. So I think the market is now pricing a very high probability of very difficult to get around tariffs, in other words, against everyone, and very broad, like against every single product in the world at the same time.
And can
I
I
want
just,
to move the conversation to the Fed.
yeah, can I just make quick points on that? So reinforcing what Karen said, I think there's two key points. The flip side of what she said about the lifting of regulatory fear and threat perception under Biden versus Trump is there's a lot of pent-up deal flow, particularly in financial services, somewhat in healthcare, obviously energy. And this is in an environment where it was implicit in what Karen said, but just to make explicit, Europe ain't doing so well, China ain't doing so well. So you potentially have a multi-year boom, even if the Fed raises rates, which we'll get to in a second, where this pent-up deal flow and changing circumstances and desire to be in the US further feeds that. The second thing I would say, and again, it just reinforces something Karen said, it's not just I'm worried about tariffs. The Stellantises, the BMWs, the Toyotas, the Hondas, everybody saw the environmental rates. That the US, and particularly under Trump, the US environmental standards are going to be completely different and lower than Europe and a lot of other places. And so this idea that you're producing differently for the US, or you're putting heavy dirty industry in the US and not elsewhere, is going to be reinforced. So just underscoring what Karen said about a short-term sort of rotation into capital market activity that I think is strong.
Would you come back to the Fed now?
Yeah.
Then? So a few months ago, in this same forum, you made a call on the Fed, and we have a meeting obviously today. There's not that much uncertainty, I don't think, about today's particular decision.
Right.
But stepping back and looking at the next sort of 6 to 9 months, A, do you think the Fed will have to go back to tightening? Is that still your view? And B, how do the sort of the politics of that play out with the Trump administration?
So, thank you for having me back, Sebastian, despite my Fed call. And I think we're here for that. And what I said in June, and I've been saying consistently, is if Trump won, 80% chance the Fed would be hiking by the end of third quarter 2025. And I stand by that call. And the market's moved a lot in that direction, but not all the way. So Karen said, Doug said, I say, basically Kevin Warsh did an op-ed, Scott Bessent did testimony saying tariffs are not necessarily inflationary. It's always fun when practitioners start parsing monetary theory. It is correct that in theory, there are certain circumstances under which tariffs are not inflationary. In a world where you're close to full employment, even now, in a world where companies are not greedflation, but do have some pricing power, in a world where there are certain goods that you cannot easily substitute for, tariffs will be felt, and certainly migration restrictions will be felt as inflation. Now, what Karen pointed out, and I very much agree with, is the Fed may choose to try to duck this. They can say, oh, it's a one-off. And what matters is the second round, and conveniently the second round of price effects are sometime close to when Jay Powell will be succeeded by someone named Kevin McKenna. And they can wait. I think this is a mistake. This is why I think in the end they'll be forced to raise sooner. I think that also relates to the underlying strength of the US economy that the Fed underestimated, and they overestimated how much their tightening was doing in a world where financial conditions were not tight. So ultimately, I think the Fed either is hiking 6, 7 months from now, maybe 8, 9 months on the outside, or is wimping out and ends up behind the curve, which, if, as Kevin Warsh said in his op-ed, you think the Fed lost some credibility on the inflation front, is not a position you want to be. I mean, it's not irretrievable. Think of it as 85 Volcker after 82 Volcker. You're slightly behind the curve. You didn't fully kill inflation the first time around, so you have to kill it even harder. Now the politics, a lot of people are very concerned about this and watching it. I think I'm worried about the Fed choosing out of a self-preservation for the institution instinct and for the economic reasons that Karen mentioned to err on the side of wanting to keep it through. And I think that's a bad risk. But I don't think in the end Trump will be able to force it to do anything. And so I think the scenario is they ease maybe once more, probably not, and they sit tight until they're forced out.
So Doug, I think you have a slightly different take on the risk there.
No, it's not a different take, it's what happens next. Last night, apparently, Trump, or the Trump administration, fired some senior officials at the EEOB and the LRB. Apparently, and I haven't done the detailed work on this, but apparently in contravention of the law.
Can you just spell out these acronyms?
Sorry, the National Labor Relations Board and the Equal Opportunity Employment.
Equal employment opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay.
And he's not supposed to be able to do that. So apparently the law says you got to defer to a Supreme Court decision which says you can only be removed for malfeasance or some other technical term, and they weren't found guilty of that. They were just fired because Trump fired them. What I was talking to Sebastian about earlier is it would not surprise me if Adam is right, then Trump says, I don't care whether the law says I can fire Powell or not. I'm going to fire Powell. Now, the only check on that would be the market reaction would be terrible. But it would not surprise me if Trump says, I want the Fed to do what I want the Fed to do. I don't care about this monetary policy BS. So you're fired. And, that's a risk that I think most of us took off the table because Trump realizes there would be a very negative response to that, and legally he's on extremely thin ice. And what we've seen in the first 9 days of this administration is whether you have the legal authority or not, explicitly or by deriving from a Supreme Court decision, Trump doesn't seem to care. And that is an uncertainty that I'm not saying is my base case, but it's certainly more heightened today than it was yesterday for me.
So just to sort of sum up where I think we are here, we've got all the good reasons why, certainly on a relative basis, the US is kind of poised for a boom, as Karen laid out. At the same time, we've got confusion and uncertainty around the tariff policy. We've got some sense that the market may not be fully pricing Adam's logic about monetary policy. We've got a potential confrontation between the Fed and the administration. Now I want to add in another thing, which is fiscal. And Doug, I think you've been tracking this closely. Talk about the fiscal gap that you see emerging.
Yeah, well, so this gets into Washington inside baseball stuff at one level, but it's enormous and macro and just existential at the other level. Because what we've seen this week is Trump hosted House Republicans in Florida. And the reports were that if you added up everything that Trump told them he wanted them to do, it reached around $10 trillion.
And this is a 10-year window.
Yeah. That's hard to reconcile with what is coming out of the House Freedom Caucus guys and the Ways and Means and Appropriations people who are all saying they want a budget resolution number to be showing a deficit tightening of between $1 and $1.5 trillion. So if you're going to spend $10 trillion more, but your idea is to get the deficit either neutral as a worst case for those guys, or to tighten it, something's got to give. And it's not going to be because he fires or gives early buyouts to the federal workforce. One of my favorite statistics, I think I mentioned it last time I was up here, is the entire salary structure of the United States federal government is under $400 billion. So if you fired every single one of them, you're not coming close to what it is they say that they want to achieve. So when you get into this, inside baseball thing of one reconciliation bill versus two reconciliation bills, and everybody's eyes glaze over, it's really important. It's really important because there is a very real scenario in which the fiscal hawks say no. Remember, in a 217, 218 kind of margin of 1 to 2 House seats on the Republican side, you can't lose the 2 or the 3 fiscal hawks who really mean it, because you can't pass the bill. So for them to get anything done, they're going to have to square a circle in a way that seems pretty hard to square. One of the tricks that they're using, and I know this is going to sound very wonky, but it's worth making a note of it, is there are two ways you can score budgets. One is on what is called the current policy baseline, and the other is the current legal baseline, right? The current legal baseline is the Trump tax cuts expire at the end of this year. So when you look at 2026, tax cuts aren't there. That's your baseline, right? That's what the law says. But if you go on the current policy baseline, you ignore that. You say, well, if we extend or don't extend the tax cuts, that's insignificant to the deficit because we're just going to go with the current policy. So what that means is you can basically mask over $4 to $5 trillion of additional deficit if you go on the current policy baseline as opposed to the current legal baseline. Now, Congress thinks they're too clever by half, in my view, and they think everybody's going to just ignore this. And maybe they will, because in past instances, it's an inside baseball thing. Nobody knows what I'm talking about, so fine. The scoring says 0, so we're going to say 0. But if you're Chip Roy, who's the leader of the House Fiscal Conservatives, or if you're Moody's or Fitch or S&P, or if you're a bond market investor focused on the debt and the deficit, you might say, wait a minute, you're just going to write away $5 trillion here because you're using the word policy instead of law? And I'm worried that the only way they're going to square the circle, whether it's 10 trillion or 4 trillion or 5 trillion, of what Trump wants and what the budget can actually produce, is by using these little tricks. And I'm just worried that somebody's going to wake up and say, we're not buying it, and you're going to actually end up not only with the 1 bill versus 2 bill dilemma, which is you can't get the tax part, so you have to do the other part, and then kick the tax part down the road to the end of the year, or that the markets are going to just simply see through this and say, we're not buying it, and then you end up with the focus on the deficit and the debt, which is a legitimate concern for everyone.
So on the debt, Karen, if Doug is saying that there's a risk that fiscal deficits will be much bigger than expected because of an attempt to, use these inside baseball tricks to not admit to how big they're making it. And then in addition, you've got some risk that, Adam Schockhauer is correct, and interest rates will be higher than people think now. That brings into the frame the question of the total debt stock. And all over Europe, they're waking up to the fact, in France, a bit in Britain and so forth, that they have a major fiscal problem. They don't know how to get out of it, and the politics just don't let them. I'm wondering whether you see, because of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, that this is still not an issue for the US, or what are you telling people when they ask?
I mean, look, it's a great question, and at the end of the day, there's no magic number, right? There's no debt number that you hit it and suddenly it's not sustainable anymore. Like the IMF and so on have tried to make loose guidance for different countries around the world. But the truth is, the limits are when you have debt that starts creating an inflation problem or a currency problem. You need an inflation problem or a currency problem for it to actually become a problem. As long as the market basically says, we don't have a currency problem, we're willing to buy all this debt, and you don't have an inflation problem, you don't really run into issues. And all you have to do is look at what's happening with the US dollar and how strong it is to know we are very far from a currency problem. And there are a lot of structural reasons why there's so much inflow in the dollar, but it just tells you how big of a shift that might be the case. The other thing is, yes, the markets are giving tremendous credibility to the idea that the US is able to keep its inflation under control. If 5 years ago you told me that inflation, core inflation, would get to where it got to over COVID, and basically bond yields or the inflation priced into bonds, what's known as break-even inflation, but what's the inflation expected over 5 or 10 years, would basically not move, I wouldn't have believed you. We've modeled this for years, and we would have assumed that if you get that big of an inflation shock, at least some probability that the US wouldn't be able to control it, you get higher inflation for longer, would be in the markets, and people really believe the Fed would have it under control, and they still do so. You're giving the Fed a lot of credibility for being able to keep inflation under control at the same time. And obviously when you look at other countries, they do run into limits a hell of a lot faster than the United States does. There's a lot of reasons behind it, but the reality is the United States is smart. Another way of looking at it is that if you look at the difference between the tax rate and the bond yield, in other words, how much people are demanding to get in risk premium to even take this debt stock out, it's not that much, and I think there's good reasons for it to be a larger spread between these two things, just to earn a normal risk premium to even buy these bonds. I think one of the reasons is that we're in a very weird expansion where the private sector hasn't borrowed that much. That borrowing basically got kind of shut out of the market during the time the Fed raised interest rates, and so many ways the government's the only borrower in town, no one kind of competing with them. What is clear is we are far from hitting those limits today, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a structural problem down the road. The last piece I'll say is that the Trump people really do believe, some of them at least, that productivity is the way out of this, right? Like if we just get more productive, the debt stock basically melts away. And it's a very hard argument to know where that's going, right? That productivity is very rarely debated in these forums because it's so structural. But all you need to do is look at something like the Draghi report in Europe to be able to say, look, over a 10-year period, that's actually what matters. Over a 10-year period, whether or not your economy is getting more productive, that's actually the thing that matters. And the United States has radically beaten every other country in the world, especially Europe. But if you look at the United Kingdom, basically shot themselves in the foot with Brexit on productivity. The United States has really beaten everyone on productivity. And the outlook for unleashing more productivity with what's about to happen with AI, maybe with a little deregulation, it's a very challenging one to really call one way or another. But I definitely think the markets are giving some probability that this stock is also manageable from that perspective.
I'm going to open up in a minute, but one last comment from Adam.
Yeah, sorry. Just the macroeconomic evidence and theory is that productivity is growth gains are great for real incomes, but broadly neutral for debt sustainability. Because the neutral rate on bonds goes up roughly 1-for-1 with your productivity growth rate. So if your G goes up and your R goes up and R minus G doesn't change, basically it's neutral on your debt sustainability. So I'm all in favor of the Trump people emphasizing productivity, and they may be right that they're going to get productivity gains, but that doesn't solve the fiscal problem. It just slides it.
Okay, who has a question? Great. Andrew. Microphone coming.
Sebastian. Doug, and also Karen, to your point, why isn't the break in that tension between serving the bond market and $10 trillion, the midterm elections, where they all expect to lose the House and then pivot Treasury third year to bipartisan deficit reduction? Why can't they just figure out the tricks? The bond market's not going to be tricked. They understand what's going on. They get through what they need. This is all about tax reform this year. Next year they're going to do the G20 at Mar-a-Lago and focus on currency reform. I'm curious what you think about that. But why can't they solve the issue in the third term about bipartisan debt reduction?
So if I understand the question, you're asking, you're saying, if the midterms result in the House going to the Dems, there would be a bipartisan, fiscally responsible outcome?
As opposed to focusing on
All right, so
choosing between two bills, which is the outlook. If you speak to Scott, that's the expectation.
well, first of all, my fear in any kind of a bipartisan setting is that nothing gets done. I cannot see, and if anything does, it's fiscally profligate, where each side says, fine, you get what you want, I get what I want, and they're even more irresponsible. But I think it's a luxury in January of 2025 to be looking to 2027 for your fiscal responsibility to be emerging. I think that that's 2 years of uncertainty that I wouldn't want to put any money on. But more than that, the reconciliation process, the two bills would be for fiscal 25 and 26. Those are the ones where the tax cuts for the next up to 10 years would basically be entrenched. And since you're not going to get anything meaningful on a bipartisan basis, the only thing that's going to be embedded in the system is whatever gets done on a partisan basis under reconciliation, which is going to be the baseline to look at for the next, could be 2 years, could be 4 years, could be 10 years.
Another question? Right, yeah, great. I'm going to remind you all that we're on the record.
Hi, thank you for a robust discussion. Munish Walterpuri, Institute for Science and Technology. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned at the top around DeepSeek and AI. I've been thinking a lot about the supply chain of AI and how we don't really understand it that well. I would be interested to hear from all of you how you think about not just DeepSeek specifically, but the various aspects of the AI supply chain, semiconductors, the software, all those different pieces, and what sorts of indicators you're watching to see, what kind of effect that's going to have.
What do you mean by what kind of uncertainty about which part of the supply chain?
The complexity and the depth. We barely understand our physical supply chains. I don't really think that we understand our digital supply chains. I think we understand chips now. But when it comes to software and some of the other aspects of it.
So I'm going to take your question and sort of build on it slightly and hand over to Adam. One clear thing from DeepSeek is, the first number they put out for the cost of training the model on closer inspection was meaningless. So that's one kind of uncertainty about, trying to understand what we're dealing with. $6 million was not a real number. Second thing is, there's uncertainty about what actual chips they used. And it seems like the first round of reports were wrong, that it was sort of an older generation of NVIDIA chips. Now it seems like it was a slightly newer one. It was the so-called China chip, which was deliberately manufactured by NVIDIA to exploit a loophole. And all of this gets to a policy question for the US, which is whether to decide that the export controls that the Biden administration placed on semiconductors are A, ineffectual and should give up and just repeal them, or B, they had a few loopholes at the beginning and now you should double down and do them more seriously because DeepSeek shows you what happens when there's a loophole. Adam and his colleagues are working on a piece which is not yet published, but I think it deals with this, and maybe you could give a view on that.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sebastian. So unashamedly, because it's good work, let me tout the work of 3 of my colleagues at the Peterson Institute. Mary Lovely, Chad Bown, who just rejoined us from the State Department, Bown, B-O-W-N, not Brown, and especially Martin Trzempa, who's the lead author of the piece that Sebastian just mentioned, and they published some stuff. Without fully channeling their work, the basic message is that Martin, Chad, and Mary have been giving for a long time is, if you can't make export controls work in the semiconductor space, it's going to be really hard to make it work anywhere else. Because in the semiconductor space, you're right about supply chains in some ways, but we know that Taiwan and Korea are the only places that do certain things. We know that Netherlands and Japan are the only places that do certain inputs. We know that all 4 of those, to varying degrees, are foreign policy military allies of the US. So if you have a known set of choke points, all of which are in allies, and you still can't really control what's going on, it tells you how daunting this is. Now, Chad, Mary, and Martin have more nuanced views about, therefore, what's the net benefit and cost. My more shallow view, not knowing enough about technology, is it's all a waste. That's me. But I think one of the points that Martin is going to make is that you really have to get into the weeds with this stuff. You really have to be on top of it. And despite the fact that Congress, talk about some of the stuff Doug was talking about, appropriated money not being spent. Congress passed stuff under Trump 1 that was supposed to beef up export control monitoring at the Commerce Department. We're 6-7 years later and they still haven't staffed up for it. And even if you staff up, then you got to maintain it and execute it and oversee it. So just to say, this is a very hard slog. Now, if we go over to the stuff CFR sponsors on the national security side of the house, they'll tell you, I heard Rush Doshi speaking, not this week, but previously at a China event, basically agreeing with those who said, if we lose at the high end of IT, it's game over. So, if it's that serious, which I'm not in a position to assess, then you have to try. But I think the warning and the result of our research, and one of the things Mary and Martin did is they have a very comprehensive list of all the measures the Biden people took. It's on our website if you want to go through it, is that it's really hard.
Another question. Right in the back there.
Thank you. Elise Lovitt. I am the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow here at the Council. Thank you for the discussion. Doug, you just kind of briefly mentioned Colombia at the top. But I was wondering if you could expand that. It does seem that the president intends to kind of use tariffs as a threat or a weapon across the board, even, for instance, with Greenland, which would open up kind of, more of an EU, if you read some of the reports, and hear the EU kind of rallying around Denmark. And I'm wondering if you see any kind of market volatility if the president continues to use, if he doesn't use across the board tariffs, but tries to use them as a geopolitical weapon, what the kind of market consequences of that could be over the long term. Thanks.
So I don't know what the market response is going to be. I think Colombia is a story that has yet to fully be told. Immediately after the crisis was alerted in real time, the story was Colombia, this is from the White House, right? Colombia acquiesced to everything Trump demanded. And then we've got press reports in the next 24 hours that actually the opposite was true, and that most of what Petro demanded was what Trump agreed to give. So we don't really know what happened, and as a consequence, we don't know what the lessons learned will all be. I think one of the lessons learned is if I'm Colombia or Panama or anywhere else, ally or pivot state that's not aligned, I am probably counter to what Trump wants to see, thinking about cozying up more to China rather than less, because I realize I have a volatile president in Washington willing to use tariffs and other economic tools in a very heavy-handed manner for reasons that are warranted or not. And I better have a hedging strategy built in. So globally, I'm worried, and I say globally, but I mean specifically in Latin America, which is supposed to be this, the renewed Monroe Doctrine they're talking about. I think we might see the exact opposite, where countries are actually saying the U.S. is not a trustworthy ally or trading partner, so we have to hedge our bets. On Greenland and the EU, I don't know if Trump fully appreciates the fact that tariffs against Denmark mean tariffs against the EU, and that because the way the trading system in the EU works, you can't do one without the other. So I don't know what to make of that. I do think Europe has been a little bit quiet. I had expected Trump to be more vitriolic about Europe because we know from history he just doesn't like Europe, and he likes to pick on areas like Europe, which are liberal democracies that are governed by consensus, because he just doesn't like any part of that. But we haven't seen that. But I would not be surprised if Europe rears its head as a trade adversary in the coming days and weeks, and we hear more, whether that's Greenland specific or not. Particularly the political weakness in Germany and in France and elsewhere means they are ripe for Trump's aggressive tactics, and I think tariffs will be part of that.
The other question.
I was going to make a quick Europe comment, because it is, when we stepped after our conversation, surprising how little, not at all, we've talked about Europe, which is that I think that a lot of attention will be paid to the day-to-day of how Trump handles the conversation with Europe, and the fact that he doesn't know how to handle the fact that it's so split up, right? And there isn't like one phone call he can make that can make all the Europe deal together, and is going to solve, Denmark and this and that, everything together. But the big picture on Europe, I think, shouldn't be missed, which is that, look, the three largest economies in the world are undoubtedly US, China, and Europe, if you take it as a block. And Europe simply is in a spot where China's had a protectionist industrial policy and mercantilist perspective on the world for a long time. The US very clearly does now. And that started under Trump 1, but has not really gone away under Biden, is going to accelerate now. Europe just can't survive as the lone big economy that sort of refuses to think in these terms and is just kind of thinking in the old world pro-globalization way. They can't be the only major economy that doesn't do any of these tools. It's just not going to work fundamentally for their economic model. They're under too much fire from the two sides. And how they handled that challenge, and even their awareness that they need to do something to handle that challenge, something needs to change. That's the big thing, and the risk for Europe is that they get caught up emotionally about how can you do this fast on Greenland rather than dealing with the big issue.
I just have to put down a marker for future discussions. This is the first thing where I completely disagree with Karen. I think if the Europeans try to do what the Chinese and the Americans are doing, they will bankrupt themselves and spend a huge amount of money to absolutely no effect. And even though it's a lousy outcome, they're better off leaning into globalization, because remember, there's a lot of the world that isn't China and the US, and China and the US are making asses of themselves, and you get all kinds of opportunities to flow to Europe. Again, it's a bad outcome. I'm not disagreeing with Karen's
Adam, I suspect where you both agree is on the point that it would be bad for Europe to be distracted, and for analysis of Europe to be distracted by the idea, how is it going with the Trump bashing?
Oh, yeah.
Because they have their own issues, laid out very clearly in the Dragon report from 6 months ago, and since that report came out, nothing has been done, and in fact, negative things have been done. And they've got their own hole to stop digging themselves deeper in.
Yeah.
And I think Sebastian's thankful that we don't always agree on everything, having us on the stage together.
Good.
Paula DePerna, thank you for the thoughtful insight. Just since we're in the uncertainty realm here, what about the environmental uncertainties, pricing in the fact that environmental science, climate science, Potsdam is telling us that 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached, meaning they're in red alert status, meaning their resilience is very much under question. The insurance industries can't cope with things like the wildfires in California. I mean, these are externalities, but is the macroeconomy just blind to the fact that these environmental resources are really on the edge, and there's their supply chain issues, workforce issues, and to talk about deregulation, I think it's decivilizing some of the movements away from prudent management of natural resources, let alone prudent management of capital. So my question really is, where do these externalities finally show up? Or will they never show up in our lifetime?
I mean, to be very, very sad, but very provocative, is at a macro level, if it's a universal shock, you can't diversify around it. So at a macro level, it probably drives up volatility, drives down growth rates, does terrible things to human beings and living things, but there's no market thing, because it's not like crypto suddenly becomes safer given its energy needs and given chaos than anything else under climate. You can say that about almost any asset class. Karen may have a very different point of view, but may have a different point of view. The other thing that's very sad, but has echoes of Jared Diamond, is if you think about the parts of the world that are fortunate enough to be in the right latitudes, it's China and the US. As bad as things are in China and the US, from a climate point of view, they're much less bad than South Asia, Africa, various places. So sadly, and this is part of the reason we're getting such bad non-response to the very real things you're talking about, is because, relatively speaking, US and China come out on top in this world, even more. It just reinforces that trend. And unless you have global solutions, you can, maybe you want to short or buy a particular reinsurer. I'm not fit to talk about that. But from a macro perspective, a global shock doesn't change. It just makes things worse relatively evenly.
Right. It might increase the volatility.
Increases the volatility, it reduces returns. It's horrible in human terms. It's horrible for living things. But as a macro forecaster,
Also a very classic collective action problem. The best probability you have is that you get a tipping point, and these can be very hard to foresee, in public perception of how important this environmental issue is, right? This already happened in Europe, and it has not happened in most of the places that matter. Certainly has not happened in the United States. But these things are very hard to foresee, and so you could get a tipping point where suddenly the public kind of says, wait a minute, we don't like these outcomes. These outcomes are not acceptable to us. The issue is you have a very tough collective action problem where even if the public, for example, in India, realized, India is a good example because some of the worst damages will be there, right? Like there will be just a number of days of the year that people can't work anymore because it's too hot, et cetera, et cetera. You take in India, which is an okay size economy, even if people there all really, really realize this and made this a priority from a kind of public policy perspective, it's a real collective action problem of what their capabilities are to change the trajectory of environmental degradation on India and global warming on India with just their action. Very, very challenging problem. And sad is the right word, it's devastating.
It's devastating. But the sort of good news of what Karen said, which I do completely agree with, is it's a political problem. It's got nothing to do with markets. If you count on whether Mark Carney's, the banks are going to save us or market, that's not it. It has to be a political agreement at an international level, and it has to be a political awakening and ideological shift, not a market shift.
Right.
Thank you for this. Two comments and a question. First, we just finished a 2-day conference in Washington at the Council on China, which was really quite remarkable in a number of ways. A bunch of the country's leading China experts. Two things, without me violating the attribution rules, I think I can say coming out of that. One is that China doesn't worry so much about tariffs, they worry about technology constraints. And they feel they can manage any tariffs that we put on them, either through transshipments or other means, or just passing on the cost to U.S. importers. Secondly, there was an observation, and it goes a little bit to Doug's point about how do we cut through the noise in the administration, that the president has been really quite soft on China in his comments from the inauguration over the last week. Much more vitriol towards Mexico, Canada, sometimes even Europe than China, and the view that actually he is not a hawk on China, maybe more of a hawk on Taiwan tariffs than on China tariffs, and that we may end up seeing fewer tariffs imposed on China than more as he seeks to cut some broader kind of phase 2 trade deal. Second comment, just on Europe, to reinforce the points, the Europeans are tying themselves in knots because they are ideologically much more committed to free trade and the WTO than the US has ever been, and yet they understand that their auto sector in particular is about to be hollowed out by Chinese electric vehicles, and you see the market share going very much down for their cars in China and up for Chinese cars in Europe. The big difference between Europe and the United States on this one is that even as they wrestle with imposing various trade remedies and getting comfortable with them, they're more open to China investing in Europe and building EVs in Europe than the US appears to be. And so they're sort of thinking, okay, Volkswagen may go down the drain, but at least we'll have an EV sector here that's owned by China in Germany, and that'll be an interesting thing to see how it plays out. My question for you, and this is just a very basic question, on tariffs. If one of the purposes of tariffs is to drive production of things that we're importing to the United States, it strikes me if tariffs work, you're not going to collect much revenue. And if they don't work, then you're going to collect more revenue. What's the dynamic there? When you talk about the $400 billion or something that might be collected, what are you assuming in terms of production being shifted domestically that is currently being imported?
So we've done at Peterson some modeling work on this. I mean, my colleagues would want to come in, and we're in the midst of a very new rush project with the Tax Foundation and the Peterson Foundation to try to watch this space. So for the next few weeks, we'll have some fresh estimates. But conceptually, what you say is right, Mike. And again, it goes to the across the board versus the specific tariffs. If you do across the board, you can't really substitute except by domestic production. And domestic production is inherently constrained because there's real economic logic, for the most part, why you're not producing domestic. So we don't produce rare earths, not because we don't have rare earths, but because most American workers can't be paid enough to do the really dirty, unpleasant mining in their communities, can't be paid enough to do the dirty, unpleasant mining. Physically, of course, we can produce rare earths here. And you can do that same exercise from pencils all the way to chips. And so the assumption is, Kim Klossing and Maury Upswell did a piece on this about 10 months ago. The basic assumption is that there are certain industries, certain goods where it is a matter of just time you can substitute. There are certain industries and certain goods where it is unbelievably expensive to produce it in the US. And there are certain goods where, yeah, you can move it. So ultimately, the revenue, if the revenue forecasts generally have a decay. So if you're doing a 10-year window like for Congress, that's going to average 1.5% to 2% of GDP in the first 3 years, as you get to the out years, it starts going down towards 1% of GDP. But again, there's limits, and there's a very good book out last fall by my colleague Robert Lawrence called Behind the Curve. And Paul Krugman, in his non-New York Times latest thing, cites this, talks about this. There's a limit to how much manufacturing you can create in the US. Because if there's a limit to how many workers you've got who can do those jobs. And especially if you're not importing migrants, there's an even tighter limit on how many people can do those jobs. And so you can turn your entire economy upside down trying to make that work, and then you're into like Soviet days, where you insist that this particular industry has to produce N million staple guns and rifles inside the Soviet Union, and we will reallocate whatever it takes to get you there. And that's really not good. So ultimately, there is, it goes back to something Karen said, it's very different whether you're doing country-specific, industry-specific or not. If you do across the board, the revenue stays up longer, but there's much less substitution because there's no relative price effect essentially. Everything just gets more expensive.
Just Mike, picking up on another aspect of your question. I mean, I always say, you know, it's either an end or a means to an end, and I don't think Trump has figured out which it is, but it can't be both at the same time. But Adam, in reference to an earlier conversation, you know, talking about something being in the weeds on the export control side. Let's just posit, this is not an administration that is very comfortable with getting into the weeds. We've seen that in the first 8 days. They're not detail-oriented. And when you talk about across-the-board tariffs, one of the problems is under IEEPA, you have to declare a national emergency. If the national emergency is we're running a trade deficit, the problem is we're not running a trade deficit with everyone. So even if, as I said earlier, there's a lot of reasons to believe legal challenges against a presidential declaration under IEEPA would not be successful, there's also a fairly good argument that if you declare that we are declaring an emergency because we have a trade deficit against every country in the world, when in fact we don't have a trade deficit against every country in the world. Those countries with which we have a trade surplus have a pretty good case to make that they are being unfairly targeted. So just in terms of projecting out revenue from tariffs, if it's across the board, there's no certainty whatsoever that that's actually going to be sustained independent of the economic forces. Just in terms of the actual implementation of what the president seeks to declare, there's a whole lot of uncertainty built into that just in year one anyway.
Unless you pass legislation, you don't use IEEPA, but for all the reasons Doug said, there's difficulties passing the legislation.
One more question? Anybody? If there isn't, I'm going to ask anybody who wants to comment on the following. So we have an upsurge in online gambling. We have a return of crypto mania. We have a sense, I think, that there's just a sort of, cultural speculation roaring back, which feels different to, again, it exacerbates this difference between, the mentality of Europe and the mentality of the US at the moment. Do any of you have a thought on why now? Why is something that, online gambling in the US was illegal until not that long ago? Why is all this coming back and what's the mean?
My quick thought is that you just said, Karen, can you list me all the things that would make the most ripe environment for the formation of financial bubbles? Not for the destruction of them, but for the formation, for that phase of blowing them up. You'd say, we're doing pretty well, right? So we're doing pretty well on the kind of environment that would create formation. I like looking at 1998, which is a case where, you kind of could say, oh, a lot of these tech companies seem kind of highly valued. Obviously, in retrospect, they don't seem very highly valued relative to what happened at the peak of the bubble, but there are already some concerns that some valuations seem high, just about as high as they got. You had an easy Fed for reasons unrelated to that at the time that don't look a lot like today's reasons, but you still have a Fed that's leaning on easy in that environment. You had the economy kind of chugging along, and then you had a lot of corporate spending and desire to, when you hear the tech leaders today, they're going out of their way, I think they're going to go out of their way to tell us, don't worry about DeepSeek. Just because they did AI computation for cheaper doesn't mean we need less compute. We still want to spend as much as we can. We're still in a race for our lives. And so that's a lot of kind of ingredients for saying there's going to be a lot of spending and a lot of speculation and a lot of blowing up of a bubble. It's not a lot of ingredients for a popping of a bubble. So.
Okay, so all the more reason to look forward to the next World Economic Update. Thank you all for coming. Reminder this on the record. The video will be up on our website.